This is Mrs. Naslund. Today we'll be looking at Unit 4, Lesson 3, Naming Triangles. Our learning target is I can define, identify, and draw right, obtuse, and acute triangles. My second learning target is I can define, identify, and draw scaling, isosceles, and equilateral triangles. The vocab we'll be discussing is what a right triangle is, an obtuse triangle, an acute triangle. We'll also be discussing what congruent triangles look like. And then lastly, we'll be looking at equilateral, isosceles, and scalene triangles. When we discuss triangles, the prefix tri means three, so it's easy to remember that a triangle has three angles, and we can use those angles to name triangles. If I look at a triangle, this triangle here, we'll notice it has one right angle. So because of that, I name this a right triangle. If I look at this triangle here, it has one obtuse angle, so I'm going to name it an obtuse triangle. Lastly, if I look at this triangle, it has three acute angles, so I'm going to name it an acute triangle. When we name triangles, we use the little triangle symbol, and then we write the different letters in that triangle. So in this case, I would draw a triangle and I'd write Q, R, S. We'll discuss naming triangles more in depth in a future lesson. What kind of triangle do we think triangle QRS is? By using my definitions of above, I know that I have one right angle. Because of that, I know that this is considered a right triangle. Let's practice this a little bit more in depth. If I look here, first what I'm going to look at is this triangle right here. I'm going to look at it and I have three acute angles, so I'm going to call this an acute triangle. How about this one here? I look at it, I have one right angle, so I'm going to give it the name of a right triangle. Lastly, let's look at this one here. I look at it, what kind of angle is that? Based on that, what name would you give this triangle? If you said an obtuse triangle because it has one obtuse angle, you were correct. Now, that's one way to name triangles is by their angles. Another way to name triangles is by looking at its sides. So a triangle that is the same, that has the same perpendicular marks on all sides are considered congruent. Meaning if I look at this triangle, all of these sides are exactly the same, so they're congruent. Another way of saying it is they're equal. In this case, because all the sides are equal, we call it an equilateral triangle. Now what if only two of them are the same? In this case, and we'll see that they have these little lines on it, meaning that they're the same length, they're congruent, they're the same, but there's only two congruent sides instead of three, and when there's only two congruent sides, we call it an isosceles triangle. Okay, an isosceles triangle, two sides are equal. It's an isosceles triangle. Now, if there are no congruent sides, none of the sides are equal or the same to each other, then we call it a scalene triangle. Okay? Again, looking back at our vocab, congruent means the same length, the same sides when they're the same. So all of these sides are the same, they're congruent. Equilateral is when all three sides are the same. Okay, all three sides are congruent. When only two sides are congruent, it's isosceles. And when none of the sides are congruent, then we say it's a scalene triangle. Now, here's a question for you. Can we mix? Oh, let's go back, sorry. Let's look at these and name them by their sides. So let's look at this first one here. I look at it, none of the sides have those little marks, meaning none of them are congruent. So if no sides are congruent, what's the name of that triangle? If you guessed a scalene triangle, then you're correct. How about this one? Look at this one, we have two of those marks that are saying they're congruent, they're the same. If only two are congruent, what do we call it? If you said an isosceles triangle, you're correct again. Lastly, how about if all three sides are congruent? They're all equal. What do we call that triangle? An equilateral triangle. Again, because all three sides are the same. All right, now, can you name triangles both by their sides and their angles? Could you name it by their sides and their angles? What do you think? The answer is yes, you can. You can name them both by their sides and their angles. So let's try that. Let's look at this triangle right here, and let's think. We'll look at the sides here. I'm looking at it, and none of the sides are the same. They're all different. So I know that it is a scaling triangle, and I also see one right angle here. So I'm going to name this triangle a right scaling triangle. Okay, I'm going to name it by its angle first and then by its sides. So in this case, it was a right scaling triangle. And again, I knew that because none of the sides were equal, none of the sides were congruent to each other, and it had a right angle. Now in this case, I'm looking, and these two sides are the same. So I'm going to draw my little tick marks there to say that they're congruent. And then I'm going to look at my angles. And I look at my angles, and they're all those acute angles. They're all less than 90. So again, I name it by my angle first. So I'm going to say it's an acute isosceles triangle. Again, because I have two of the sides are the same, it's an isosceles triangle. All right, let's do one more. I look at this triangle, and none of these sides are the same, but I do notice that I have an obtuse angle right there. So when I name this triangle, I'm going to call it an obtuse scaling, because none of the sides are equal, triangle. And that's how I name a triangle both by its angle and by its sides. That concludes our lesson on 4.2 on naming triangles.